The vast Montana sky darkened as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings of the Double S Ranch. Dust swirled across the open plains where Sarah Miller stood on her weather-beaten porch, shielding her eyes from the setting sun that painted the clouds in shades of amber and crimson. At 32, the widowed rancher had grown accustomed to reading the sky like others read books, and today's story spelled trouble in every line of its darkening pages. "Jamie! Michael, Lucy!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the yard where her 3 foster children played beneath the gnarled branches of the old oak tree. The wind had begun to pick up, sending their laughter dancing on the air like music from a happier time. "Time to come in." The children, lost in their innocent game of tag, didn't seem to hear her over the rising wind that whistled through the ranch buildings like a mournful song. 10-year-old Jamie, with his sun-bleached hair and earnest brown eyes, was chasing 8-year-old Michael around the tree's massive trunk. 7-year-old Lucy, the youngest and most fragile of the 3, sat in the grass braiding wildflowers into chains, her small fingers working with the careful precision of a child who had learned early that beautiful things were precious and fleeting. Sarah's worry deepened as she caught sight of a plume of dust approaching from the north, a rider coming fast across the open range. She hadn't been expecting visitors, and unexpected company rarely brought good news to the Double S. Since her husband Tom's passing 3 years ago, the ranch had become increasingly isolated from the community that had once embraced them. The neighboring ranchers offered help when they could spare it, but most had quietly written off a widow's chances of making it through another harsh Montana winter alone. The rider drew closer, and Sarah recognized the familiar silhouette of Jackson Stone, owner of the neighboring Stone Creek Ranch. Her heart did an unexpected flutter, part anxiety, part something she didn't want to name. Jackson had been Tom's best friend growing up, 2 boys who had learned to rope and ride on these same Montana plains. But they'd had a bitter falling out years ago over something neither man would ever fully explain to her. When Tom died in that terrible flood while trying to rescue stranded cattle, Jackson had appeared at the funeral like a ghost from their shared past. He'd offered to buy her land then, assuming she couldn't manage alone with 3 grieving children and a ranch that demanded more than one person could give. She'd refused, of course, her pride burning as fierce as the summer sun. The Double S was her home, the only security her foster children had ever known in their young lives marked by loss and uncertainty. Jackson hadn't taken the rejection well. His offers had grown more insistent over the months that followed, though always couched in concern for her welfare. Each time, Sarah had turned him down, growing more defensive with each encounter until they barely spoke when their paths crossed in town. The wind picked up dramatically as Jackson dismounted near the porch, his movements efficient and sure. He was still tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work and hands that spoke of honest labor. His Stetson cast a shadow over eyes, the color of a summer storm gray-blue, and just as unpredictable. Despite herself and their complicated history, Sarah noted he still cut an impressive figure against the darkening sky. "Sarah," he nodded, removing his hat in a gesture that belonged to an older, more courteous time. His dark hair was touched with silver now at the temples, marking the years that had passed since they'd last stood this close. "Been a while," she replied carefully, crossing her arms across her chest. "What brings you by, Jackson?" "If it's about buying the ranch, my answer hasn't changed." Jackson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he shook his head. "Not today. I came to warn you." His voice carried an urgency that made her stomach clench. "There's a storm coming. Worst one I've seen brewing in years. Radio says it might be a supercell." As if summoned by his words, lightning forked across the sky in a brilliant display, followed by a distant rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The children looked up from their game for the first time, finally noticing the darkening sky that had swallowed the sun. "I've weathered storms before," Sarah replied, though concern crept into her voice like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. The barn roof still hadn't been fully repaired after last season's damage, another expense she couldn't afford, and the creek that ran through her property had a dangerous tendency to flood, turning from a gentle stream into a raging torrent that could sweep away everything in its path. Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone of urgent intimacy. "Not like this one, Sarah. Your north pasture fence is still down in places from the spring flooding. If your cattle scatter in the storm, you'll lose half your herd before you can round them up again." Sarah bristled at his assumption that she couldn't manage her own ranch, even as she recognized the uncomfortable truth in his words. She'd been putting off fence repairs, prioritizing the children's needs over the ranch's infrastructure. It was a gamble that might be about to cost her everything. "I appreciated the warning," she said stiffly, her pride warring with the growing fear in her chest. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, illuminated their faces in stark relief. The air felt charged with electricity, heavy with the promise of violence to come. The wind whipped Sarah's auburn hair across her face as she called to the children again, more urgently now. "Listen," Jackson said, his expression softening in a way that reminded her painfully of the young man who had once been part of their extended family. "I've got my ranch hands securing everything at Stone Creek right now. I can spare 2 men to help you batten down before this hits." Pride warred with practicality in Sarah's mind as she watched, the storm clouds rolling toward them like a dark army across the plains. She needed the help desperately, but accepting it from Jackson felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she truly couldn't manage alone. Before she could formulate an answer, the wind gusted violently, sending a loose piece of roofing flying from the barn like a giant bird with metal wings. The sheet of corrugated iron crashed near the children's play area with a sound like thunder, and they screamed in genuine terror, scrambling away from the twisted metal that had missed little Lucy by mere feet. "Come in before it's too late," Sarah ordered, fear making her voice sharp and commanding. The 3 children ran toward the house, their faces pale with shock, the reality of their danger finally penetrating their innocent games. Jackson's storm-colored eyes met hers across the space between them, concern evident in every line of his weathered face. "Let me help, Sarah. Not for you, if that's how you want it," he said quietly. "For Tom's kids." The words hit her like a physical blow. "They're my kids now," she corrected him, her voice fierce with protective love. But as the sky turned an ominous green-black, color that spoke of tornadoes and destruction, she knew she couldn't let pride endanger her family or her livelihood. The double S might be all they had left of their old life, but it would mean nothing if they didn't survive the night. "Fine," she conceded, the word tasting like defeat in her mouth. "Send your men." But Jackson, she met his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of strength she built through 3 years of widowhood. "This doesn't change anything about the ranch." Jackson nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll be back with them in 20 minutes. Get those kids somewhere safe and find whatever waterproofs you have. This is going to be a long night." As he mounted his horse and rode back toward his ranch, his figure quickly swallowed by the gathering darkness, Sarah hustled inside where the children waited. They huddled together in the living room, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that spoke of deeper losses, older storms they'd already weathered in their short lives. The first fat drops of rain began to strike the windows like urgent fingers tapping for entry, and Sarah wondered if she was about to lose everything Tom had worked so hard to build, and everything these children needed to feel safe in a world that had already taken too much from them. Part 2. Into the Storm. The First sheets of rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury as Sarah helped the children into dry clothes, their small faces etched with worry that seemed too mature for their years. 10-year-old Jamie, the oldest and the one who felt responsible for his younger companions, tried to maintain a brave face, but his hands trembled as he buttoned his flannel shirt with fingers that remembered too many nights of uncertainty. 8-year-old Michael kept peering out the window, counting seconds between lightning and thunder with the methodical precision of a child who had learned that measuring danger might somehow make it manageable. 7 seconds, he announced after a particularly bright flash that turned the world white for an instant. That means it's getting closer, doesn't it? 7-year-old Lucy, the baby of their makeshift family, clung to Sarah's side like a burr, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. The toy was worn smooth from years of comforting frightened children, its button eyes holding secrets of countless tears and whispered fears. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the rain as Jackson returned with 2 ranch hands, their figures barely visible through the wall of water that had begun to fall from the sky. Sarah watched through the window as they dismounted and hurried toward the barn, already beginning to secure loose equipment and reinforce doors that groaned under the wind's assault. "Stay inside," she instructed the children, pulling on her oilskin coat that still smelled faintly of Tom's cologne, a ghost of comfort she couldn't quite bring herself to wash away. "I need to help with the animals, but you always said we should never go out in a storm," Jamie protested, his young face creased with worry that made him look far older than his 10 years. Sarah knelt and took his hands in hers, feeling how cold they'd become despite the warmth of the house. Sometimes grown-ups have to do dangerous things to protect what's important. "I promise I'll be careful." Lucy's bottom lip trembled as she whispered, "Like Daddy was being careful?" The innocent question pierced Sarah's heart like a blade. Tom had died trying to rescue stranded cattle during a flash flood, much like the one brewing outside their door. The parallel wasn't lost on any of them, least of all the children who had watched one parent figure disappear into a storm and never come. On that, Sarah forced a reassuring smile that felt brittle on her face. "I'll be back before you know it. Jamie's in charge until then, all right?" The boy straightened his narrow shoulders, taking the responsibility seriously as she'd known he would. These children had grown up too fast, learned too young that the adults they depended on could vanish without. Warning. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, immediately drenched by driving rain that stung her face like needles. In the barn, Jackson and his men were working with quiet efficiency, moving nervous horses into stalls and reinforcing the weakened sections of roof with whatever materials they could find. Jackson looked up as she entered, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat like a curtain. "Your south pasture cattle are headed for the low ground," he shouted over the storm's roar. "We need to move them before the creek floods, or they'll be trapped." Sarah's stomach dropped to somewhere around her boots. If her cattle were trapped when the creek overflowed, they'd either drown or be swept away. Either way, she'd lose the livestock that represented her only real source of income. "I'll saddle Penny," she replied, moving toward her Mari's stall with determined steps. "Sarah, wait." Jackson caught her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "Let Diego and Matt handle it. They know what they're doing in weather like this." She pulled away, her independence flaring like a match struck in darkness. "This is my ranch, my livestock, and those are your children in that house," Jackson countered, his voice softening despite the storm's fury. "They've already lost one parent to a flood." The statement hit her like a physical blow, the truth of it stealing her breath. Jackson seemed to regret his words immediately, but they both knew he was right. The children's nightmares had only recently begun to fade, 3 years after watching their adoptive father ride out into a storm and never return. Sarah hesitated, torn between responsibility for her livelihood and her duty to the 3 souls who depended on her completely. A tremendous crash of thunder shook the barn, rattling the tools hanging on the walls. One of the horses reared in its stall, nearly breaking free in its panic. "We'll handle the cattle," Jackson said firmly, already instructing his men with the kind of calm authority that came from years of leadership. "You secure the house and keep those kids safe." That's what Tom would want. The mention of her late husband stung, but Sarah nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom even as it galled her pride. As the men rode out into the storm, their shapes quickly swallowed by the rain and darkness, she hurried back to the house, fighting against wind that seemed determined to knock her off her feet. Inside, she found the children huddled together on the sofa, a single lantern casting long shadows across their frightened faces. The electricity had already gone out, as it always did when storms hit their isolated corner of Montana. "Is Mr. Stone helping us?" Jamie asked, his perception surprising Sarah with its clarity. "Yes," she admitted, wringing water from her hair with hands that shook slightly. "He's helping move our cattle to higher ground. Dad always said Mr. Stone was the best cowboy in the county," Michael said quietly, his voice small in the darkness. Before they stopped being friends, Sarah paused in her efforts to dry off, wondering what else Tom had told the children about Jackson Stone. That's right. They grew up together on neighboring ranches, learned everything they knew side by side. Lucy looked up with curious eyes that reflected the lantern's glow. Why did they stop being friends? Before Sarah could formulate an answer that would satisfy a 7-year-old's need for understanding, a deafening crash shook the entire house. The kitchen window exploded inward as a large tree branch punched through it like a giant's fist, bringing rain and wind howling into their sanctuary. The children screamed, pressing against each other in terror as glass scattered across the floor like deadly stars. Sarah rushed them into the hallway, away from the flying debris, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stay here," she ordered, grabbing a tarp from the mudroom. Fighting against the wind that tried to tear the makeshift covering from her hands, she managed to secure it over the broken window, but not before the kitchen floor was thoroughly flooded. As she worked, Sarah's mind raced through calculations she didn't want to make. The Double S had been struggling financially since Tom's death. Each month a careful balance between necessary expenses and mounting debts. This storm damage would be another setback she could ill afford. Another step closer to the edge of a cliff she'd been walking for 3 years. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, a sound like all the loneliness in the world given voice. Sarah gathered blankets and pillows, creating a nest for the children in the hallway, the safest place in the house, away from windows and the possibility of more flying debris. "Are we going to lose our home?" Jamie asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah sat beside them, pulling all 3 close in an embrace that was as much for her comfort as theirs. "No, sweetheart. This house is strong, just like we are. But you can't fix everything by yourself," Michael observed with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. "Dad always said ranching isn't a one-person job." Sarah had no answer for that painful truth. The boy was right, as children so often were when adults tried to fool themselves. She'd been running herself ragged for 3 years, trying to prove she could manage alone, refusing help from neighbors out of pride, and perhaps fear that accepting assistance would somehow diminish what she and Tom had built. Together, the storm raged on, minutes stretching into hours that felt like days. The children eventually dozed fitfully, exhausted by fear and excitement, their small bodies finally succumbing to sleep despite the chaos outside. Sarah kept vigil, straining to hear any sound of Jackson's return over the wind that seemed determined to tear their world apart. When the back door finally burst open around midnight, she jumped to her feet, grabbing the shotgun she kept for emergencies. Old habits from a woman who had learned to protect herself and what was hers. Jackson stood in the doorway like some elemental force made human, drenched and mud-splattered, his hat hanging from his hand. Their eyes met across the dim room, and Sarah slowly lowered the gun, relief flooding through her like warm water. "The cattle?" she asked, afraid to hear the answer. "Safe," he replied, removing his dripping coat with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. "Got them to the North Ridge just before the creek overflowed. They're spooked but unhurt." He glanced at the sleeping children, his expression softening. "They okay?" Sarah nodded, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude that threatened to crack the careful composure she'd maintained all evening. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of what he'd done. Jackson shrugged, as if riding out into a killer storm was nothing more than checking the mail. "Your barn roof didn't make it," he said gently, as if softening the blow might somehow make it hurt less. "West Side caved in, but we got all the animals out first. Another expense she couldn't afford. Another piece of the life she'd built with Tom crumbling away like sand through her fingers." Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of her situation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Through the broken window came the sound of the creek running high and fast, carrying away pieces of fence and dreams in equal measure. The storm was far from over, but the worst seemed to have passed. Now came the harder part, surveying the damage and figuring out how to rebuild with resources that had been stretched thin long before the storm arrived. As dawn approached, with tentative fingers of light, Sarah wondered if this night had changed everything, or if it had simply revealed truths she'd been trying to avoid for far too long. Part 3. Damage and Decisions. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light pushing through the dissipating clouds, revealing a landscape transformed by the storm's fury. Sarah stood on her porch, surveying the damage with a heavy heart that felt as battered as the ranch around her. Broken boards lay scattered across the muddy yard like the bones of some great beast, while pieces of roofing hung from fence posts where the wind had flung them in its rage. The barn's west side had indeed collapsed, just as Jackson had warned. The ancient structure, which had weathered decades of Montana storms, finally lay defeated, its timbers jutting skyward like the ribs of a shipwreck. Debris was scattered everywhere: tools, hay bales, pieces of machinery that represented months of saved pennies and careful budgeting. Fences were down in multiple places, their posts snapped like matchsticks or pulled clean from the earth. The creek had overflowed its banks during the night, leaving parts of her lower pasture underwater and strewn with debris carried from upstream. What had been green grazing land yesterday was now a swamp, dotted with broken trees and the occasional piece of someone else's property. Jackson appeared beside her, having spent the night in her living room after his men returned to Stone Creek to assess their own damage. In the soft morning light, she noticed details she'd missed in the chaos of the storm. The lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face, the gray that had begun to thread more heavily through his dark hair, the way his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility like a yoke. "It's bad," Sarah admitted, a voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might bring the damaged buildings crashing down around them. "But it could have been worse," Jackson replied, his tone gentle but honest. "Your cattle are safe, the house is sound, and most importantly, you and the kids came through without a scratch." Sarah gave a hollow laugh that held no humor. "With what money, Jackson?" "The bank's already breathing down my neck about the mortgage payments. I can't take on more debt, not when I'm already drowning." She hadn't meant to reveal so much. Her financial struggles had been a closely guarded secret, a source of shame that she carried alone. But exhaustion and the overwhelming scope of the destruction had lowered her defenses, and the admission hung in the air between them like morning mist. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I've got lumber at my place," he said finally. "More than I need for current projects. And my crew could use the work this week." "I can't pay you," Sarah said stiffly, her pride flaring even in the face of overwhelming need. I'm not asking for payment. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and years of hard living. Consider it making things right. Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the screen door banged open behind them with its familiar protest. The children tumbled out onto the porch, eager to inspect the storm's aftermath, despite their lingering fear from the night before. "Whoa!" Michael exclaimed, his 8-year-old eyes wide as saucers as he took in the destruction. "It looks like a giant stomped on everything." "Mr. Stone." Lucy ran straight to Jackson, surprising both adults when she threw her small arms around his legs without hesitation. "Did you really save all our cows?" Jackson looked down at the small girl clinging to him, and something in his weathered features softened like ice melting in spring sunshine. He awkwardly patted her tangled hair with one large hand, a smile transforming his stern face. "Sure did, little lady. They're all safe up on the ridge, probably wondering what all the fuss was about. Can we go see them?" Jamie asked, already halfway down the porch steps with the fearless curiosity of a 10-year-old boy. "Hold on there," Sarah called, her motherly instincts kicking in. "There's too much debris and standing water everywhere. It's not safe yet." Disappointment clouded their faces until Jackson stepped forward with an idea. "How about you three help me clean up the yard instead? If we all work together, we can get this place looking like home again in no time." The children brightened at the prospect of being useful, of having some way to contribute to fixing their world. Sarah watched in amazement as Jackson organized them into an efficient cleanup crew, giving each child age-appropriate tasks that made them feel important and capable. As the morning progressed, more help began to arrive. Word had spread through the small community about the Double S's troubles, and neighbors Sarah hadn't spoken to in months started showing up with tools and supplies, ready to lend whatever assistance they could provide. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring spread arrived with fresh bread and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Young Billy Martinez, whose family ran sheep on the land to the east, came with his father and a truck full of fence posts. Even old Pete Garrison, who rarely left his cabin in the hills, appeared with a toolbox and a determination to help that surprised everyone. By midday, a makeshift outdoor kitchen had been set up on tables borrowed from the church, and the yard buzzed with purposeful activity. Sarah found herself sitting next to Jackson during the impromptu lunch, watching as the children played with the neighbors' kids, their earlier fears forgotten in the sunshine and the security of community support. "I don't understand," she said quietly, a voice barely carrying over the conversation and laughter around them. "Why is everyone helping like this? I haven't exactly been ... social ... since Tom died." Jackson took a thoughtful sip from his coffee mug, steam rising in the warm air. "Because that's what neighbors do, Sarah. It's something you've forgotten since Tom passed, but it's still true." She bristled at his bluntness, old defenses rising automatically. "I didn't want charity. It's not charity to accept help when you need it," Jackson replied calmly, his gray eyes meeting hers without flinching. "It's just part of living in a community." Tom understood that better than most. "Don't tell me what Tom knew," Sarah snapped, old pain surfacing like oil on water. "You two weren't even speaking when he died." Jackson set down his mug carefully, his expression turning serious in a way that made her stomach clench. "Is that what you think? That Tom and I were still fighting when he died?" Confusion flickered across Sarah's face as she studied his expression. "Weren't you? He never mentioned you two reconnecting." Jackson shook his head slowly, sadness creeping into his voice. "We made peace 6 months before the accident. Sarah had a long talk up at Carson's Ridge, cleared the air about everything that had come between us." Sarah stared at him, her world tilting slightly as this revelation sank in. "He never told me. Maybe he was waiting for the right time," Jackson suggested gently. Or maybe he knew you'd need a friend someday, and he wanted to make sure I'd be here when you did. The words hit her like a physical blow, reshaping everything she thought she understood about the last months of Tom's life. If he and Jackson had reconciled, if Tom had trusted his old friend enough to share that confidence, then what else had she misunderstood about their situation? Across the yard, Lucy's bright laughter rang out as one of the neighbor women showed her how to properly hammer a nail into a fence post. The sound pierced Sarah's heart with its pure joy. When was the last time she'd heard any of her children laugh like that, without reservation or fear? "I've been so focused on not losing the ranch that I forgot what it's really about," she admitted softly. The words pulled from some deep, honest place she'd kept locked away. "It's their home, their security. I thought I had to do it all alone to prove I was strong enough to keep it." Jackson nodded, understanding flickering in his storm-colored eyes. "Strength isn't about carrying everything alone, Sarah. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let others help carry the load." As the day wore on, the transformation was remarkable. The collapsed barn was cleared of debris. The broken fence posts were replaced with new ones, and the flooded areas began to drain as volunteers dug channels to redirect the water flow. The children worked alongside the adults, their small hands contributing to the effort in ways that made them beam with pride. Sarah found herself watching Jackson more closely as the hours passed. She observed how naturally the children gravitated toward him, how he responded to their endless questions with patience and genuine interest. Lucy appointed herself his official helper, following him around with a child's unwavering devotion. Michael peppered him with technical questions about ranching and repairs, while Janie studied his every movement with the intense focus of a boy hungry for male guidance. As evening approached and the neighbors began to pack up their tools, Sarah realized something fundamental had shifted. The storm had indeed damaged her property, but it had also blown away some of the walls she built around herself and her small family. For the first time in 3 years, they didn't feel quite so alone against the world. Standing on her porch as the last of the volunteers drove away, Sarah felt a complex mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The immediate crisis had passed, but larger questions remained. Questions about the ranch's future, about her ability to provide for the children, and about the complicated feelings that Jackson's presence was stirring up inside her heart. Part 4. Revelations and Reckonings. The next few days passed in a blur of purposeful activity that transformed the Double S from a storm-ravaged property into something that looked almost like home again. Jackson and his men appeared each morning before sunrise, working alongside Sarah and the steady stream of neighbors who continued to show up with tools, supplies, and the kind of quiet determination that defined frontier communities. The barn roof was rebuilt with sturdy new timber, its fresh boards standing out like hope against the weathered walls. Fences were mended and reinforced, creating clean lines across pastures that had been scarred by the storm's fury. The flooded lower pastures slowly dried under the autumn sun, revealing grass that would recover in time for next season's grazing. Throughout it all, Sarah found herself watching Jackson with the children, marveling at how naturally they responded to his presence. He was patient with Lucy's endless stream of questions, teaching her the names of different tools and explaining why certain repairs had to be done in specific ways. Michael followed him around like a shadow, soaking up knowledge about ranch work with the desperate hunger of a boy who missed having a father figure in his life. But it was Janie's reaction that surprised her most. The 10-year-old, who had become fiercely protective of their small family unit, seemed to accept Jackson's help without the wariness he usually showed strangers. More than once, Sarah caught the boy watching Jackson work with an expression of longing that made her heart ache. On the third evening after the storm, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing her finances, the same grim numbers that had been haunting her sleep for months. Despite the community's generous help with repairs, The fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Double S was struggling financially, and the bank wouldn't wait forever for mortgage payments that seemed increasingly impossible to make. A knock at the screen door interrupted her calculations, and she looked up to see Jackson standing there with his hat in his hands, the last golden light of sunset painting everything in shades of memory. "Kids asleep?" he asked, stepping inside when she nodded toward the stairs. "Finally," Sarah replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "They're exhausted. Michael spent the whole day following you around like a lost puppy." Jackson settled into the chair across from her, his long frame folding with the careful movements of a man who'd spent his life doing physical work. "He's a good kid. Smart, too. Reminds me of Tom at that age, always asking questions. Never satisfied with simple answers. They all miss having a father figure," Sarah admitted. Then immediately regretted the admission when she saw something flicker in Jackson's storm-gray eyes. He nodded toward the papers spread across the table like evidence of her failures. "That bad?" Sarah hesitated, then pushed the bank statement toward him with movements that felt like surrender. There was no use hiding what he probably already suspected. 6 more months, maybe less, before I lose everything." Jackson studied the figures with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. When he finally looked up, his expression was thoughtful rather than pitying. "There might be a solution," he said carefully, "but you're not going to like it. If you're about to suggest buying my land again—" "Not buying," he interrupted, raising one hand to forestall her automatic rejection. "Partnering." Sarah stared at him as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What?" "The Double S and Stone Creek sharing resources. Combined operation, 2 ranches working together." Jackson's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "We both benefit your water rights from my equipment and larger workforce. Combined herds mean better breeding stock. Shared labor costs reduce expenses for both operations." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. It wasn't unheard of ranches sometimes consolidated during hard times, pooling resources to weather economic storms that would destroy them individually. But the idea of partnering with Jackson Stone felt loaded with complications she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "Why would you want to partner with a failing ranch?" she asked suspiciously, her defensive instincts flaring. Jackson's gaze held steady, unflinching in its honesty. "Because it's what Tom wanted." The statement hung between them like a challenge thrown down in the dust of some cosmic arena. Sarah's heart began to pound against her ribs as she studied his face, searching for signs of deception and finding none. "Explain," she said quietly. Jackson took a deep breath, as if preparing to cross a river he'd been avoiding for years. "When we made peace 6 months before he died, Tom was already worried about the ranch's future. The drought had been hard on everyone. Cattle prices were falling, and he could see the financial strain building even then." He paused, his fingers working the brim of his hat with unconscious nervousness. "He asked me to look out for you and the kids if anything happened to him. Not just money or occasional help, but really look out for you. Make sure you didn't lose everything he'd worked so hard to build." "He would never have asked you to bail me out," Sarah protested, her pride stinging at the implication. "Not bail you out," Jackson corrected firmly. "Partner with you. He knew you were more than capable of running this place, Sarah, but he also knew how isolated you were becoming, how determined you were to prove you could handle everything alone." Anger flashed through her like lightning in a summer storm. "So this is all just you fulfilling some deathbed promise? Playing the hero for a dead man's widow?" "No," Jackson said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her stop and really listen. "It started that way, maybe. But these past few days, watching you with those kids, seeing how hard you fight for this place, double quotes," he met her eyes directly. "It's more than a promise now." Their gazes locked across the table, and for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to really see Jackson Stone, not as Tom's former friend or a potential threat to her independence, but as a man who had spent 3 years quietly watching over them from a distance, respecting her need for space while making sure help was available when she needed it most. What was it? She asked suddenly, the question emerging from some deep place she'd kept locked away. The fight between you and Tom. All these years, neither of you would tell me what really happened. Jackson looked away, conflict evident in the lines around his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear him. It was about you, Sarah. The revelation stunned her into silence. Me? Before you met Tom, you and I ... double quotes. Jackson paused, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. We had that summer together. The county fair, the rodeo dance, all those long evenings talking under the stars. Memory rushed back like floodwater. A younger Jackson Stone, handsome and full of dreams, stolen kisses behind the fairgrounds. The feeling that anything was possible when she was 17, and the whole world seemed to stretch endlessly before them. But then I got that job offer in Wyoming. Jackson continued, his voice heavy with old regret. I asked you to come with me, but you weren't ready to leave your family's ranch. Said you needed more time to think about it, and I left thinking I'd come back for you someday, he added quietly. When I was more established, when I could offer you the kind of life you deserved. And when you returned, I was engaged to Tom, Sarah finished softly, the pieces of an old puzzle finally falling into place. Jackson nodded, pain flickering across his weathered features. I was angry, felt betrayed, even though I knew I had no right to be. I said things to Tom. I shouldn't have accused him of stealing you away while I was gone, of taking advantage of my absence. Sarah's breath caught as she remembered that terrible night 15 years ago, when Tom had come home with bruised knuckles and a split lip, refusing to explain what had happened beyond saying that Jackson Stone was no longer welcome on their property. He hit you, she said, understanding flooding through her. Decked me right there in Parsons Bar, Jackson confirmed with a rueful smile. And I deserved it. What I said was cruel and unfair. Tom never stole anything. You made your choice, and it was the right one. You two were perfect together. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken truth. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she thought of Tom, stubborn and proud, but ultimately big-hearted, carrying the burden of that fight for 15 years before finally reaching out to heal old wounds. When he came to you 6 months before he died, she whispered, "What did he say?" Jackson's smile was soft with memory. That life was too short for old grudges. That we'd both been young and stupid, and what mattered now was family, your family. He said you were going to need friends when the hard times came, and he wanted to make sure I'd be one of them. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she imagined her husband, knowing somehow that his time was limited, carefully mending bridges he thought she might need to cross someday. It was exactly the kind of thing Tom would do, looking after everyone else's needs, even when facing his own mortality. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her voice breaking with the weight of fear and hope warring in her chest. Partner with you, see you every day, try to explain it to the children, ... Jackson reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers with gentle warmth. We don't have to decide everything tonight, Sarah, but think about it, really think about what Tom would want for you and those kids. Do you think he'd want you to lose everything out of pride? Or would he want you to accept help from someone who cares about your family's future? Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the repaired fences and rebuilt barn, carrying with it the promise of winter and the need for decisions that couldn't be postponed much longer. Sarah looked down at Jackson's hand covering hers, feeling the rough texture of honest work and the steady warmth of a man who had kept faith with a promise made to a dying friend for the first time in 3 years. The path forward didn't feel quite so lonely or impossible to navigate alone. Part 5. Community and Confessions. The autumn fair arrived 2 weeks after the storm, bringing with it the sweet smell of funnel cakes and the excited chatter of families gathering for the season's final celebration. Sarah stood by the fence of the rodeo grounds, watching as Jackson helped Jamie adjust his grip on a small lasso, the boy's face a picture of fierce concentration as he prepared for his first youth competition. "Keep your wrists straight," Jackson instructed patiently, his large hands guiding the 10-year-old's smaller ones. "The rope should feel like an extension of your arm, not something you're fighting against." Jamie nodded seriously, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused all his attention on mastering the technique. Beside Sarah, Lucy bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement, cotton candy stuck to her fingers and somehow managing to find its way into her hair, despite Sarah's best efforts to keep her clean. Michael had wandered off to inspect the 4-H exhibits, proudly showing anyone who would listen the woodworking project he and Jackson had completed together, a small jewelry box with careful dovetail joints that spoke of patient instruction and eager learning. "They look happy," came a familiar voice beside her. Martha Wilson, who ran the general store and seemed to know everyone's business before they did themselves, smiled knowingly at Sarah. "Haven't seen those children this relaxed since before Tom passed." Sarah couldn't deny the truth in the observation. The children had indeed blossomed since the storm, thriving under the attention of the community and especially under Jackson's patient guidance. The nightmares that had plagued them since Tom's death had finally begun to fade, replaced by the kind of carefree sleep that belonged to children who felt truly secure. "They do," Sarah agreed, watching as Jamie successfully roped the practice dummy and earned an enthusiastic high five from Jackson. "The whole community has been wonderful to them. And what about you?" Martha asked gently, her weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from decades of watching over her neighbors. "You looking happier too, Sarah Miller." Sarah felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the gentle teasing in Martha's voice. In the 2 weeks since Jackson had proposed their partnership, they'd spent almost every day together, drawing up agreements, combining their herds in the high pasture, and planning for the winter ahead. The work was still hard, but somehow it felt lighter when shared between willing partners. "I'm getting there," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. The papers making their partnership official had been signed just yesterday, witnessed by her lawyer and the bank manager, who had seemed relieved to see the Double S's financial situation stabilized. The ranch would remain in her name, but now it had the security of Stone Creek's resources behind it, ensuring that the children's future was protected no matter what challenges lay ahead. But something else had happened during those 2 weeks of working closely together, something Sarah hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to handle. Old feelings, long buried beneath grief and the daily struggle for survival, had begun to resurface like spring flowers pushing through the last of winter's snow. There were moments when their hands accidentally touched while passing tools, sending unexpected sparks up her arm. Late nights talking over coffee after the children were asleep, their conversation ranging from practical ranch matters to deeper questions about dreams and disappointments. The way Jackson looked at her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, with an expression that spoke of carefully banked feelings and patient hope. She hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. This growing warmth between them felt somehow disloyal to Tom's memory, like betraying the love that had been the foundation of her adult life. And yet, if what Jackson had said was true, if Tom had truly made peace with their past and wanted her to have friends and support in the difficult times ahead, perhaps this too was part of his final gift to his family. "Mom, watch me," Jamie called out, preparing for another throw. Sarah waved enthusiastically, her heart full at the simple sound of being called Mom so easily and naturally. When the children had first come to the double, 3 years ago, traumatized by their journey through an overburdened foster system. They've been wary of attachments that might disappear without warning. Tom had won them over with his patient kindness and unwavering stability, becoming the father they'd never really had. After his death, they'd clung to Sarah like survivors of a shipwreck, afraid that she too might vanish if they let her out of their sight. Now they were truly thriving, putting down roots in this community that had finally opened its arms to embrace them all. They had friends, responsibilities, and the kind of security that allowed children to dream about the future instead of just surviving each day. As the afternoon waned, Sarah found herself walking with Jackson through the fairgrounds, the children having run ahead with friends to ride the carnival attractions that appear magically each year like something from a traveling dream. For the first time in months, she and Jackson were alone together in public, and she was acutely aware of the curious glances from neighbors who had been watching their partnership develop with the keen interest of people who cared about both parties involved. "I want to show you something," Jackson said, steering her toward a quiet corner behind the exhibition hall where the noise of the fair faded to a distant hum. Sarah followed, curious about the sudden seriousness in his tone. He stopped beside an ancient oak tree, its massive trunk scarred by decades of initials and hearts carved by generations of local couples who had pledged their love beneath its spreading branches. "Remember this spot?" he asked softly, his storm-gray eyes watching her face carefully. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as memory rushed back with startling clarity. Of course she remembered. It was here, 20 years ago, that a young Jackson Stone had first kissed her at the county fair, her 17-year-old heart racing with the thrill of first love and infinite possibility. "I carved something here the day before I left for Wyoming," Jackson continued, running his weathered fingers over the rough bark until he found what he was looking for. Here, there, weathered by years of Montana winters, but still legible, were the initials JS plus SM, surrounded by a heart that had been carved with the careful precision of a young man desperately in love. "You never told me," Sarah whispered, reaching out to trace the faded letters with trembling fingers. "I thought I'd have time to show you when I came back," Jackson replied, his voice rough with old emotion. "But by then, double quotes, by then I was Sarah Miller, not Sarah Matthews anymore," she finished, understanding flooding through her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the fair washing over them, calliope music from the carousel, children's laughter, the announcer calling the next rodeo event. The past and present seemed to collide in this quiet space beneath the old oak, where young love had once carved its hopes into living wood. "Tom knew," Jackson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "When we made peace, he brought me here, showed me that he'd found these initials years ago, probably not long after you were married." Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the image of her husband discovering this testament to Jackson's long-ago love and carrying that knowledge silently for years. "What did he say?" she asked, afraid to hear the answer but needing to know. Jackson's smile was soft with memory and old pain. He said, "Maybe things work out the way they're meant to, even when it doesn't make sense to us at the time." Sarah was always going to choose the life that made her happiest, and I was lucky enough to be the one who could give that to her. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she heard Tom's voice and Jackson's words, practical and philosophical, wise and kind, always thinking of others' happiness before his own. It sounded exactly like something her husband would say, finding grace and acceptance even in situations that might have made other men bitter or resentful. "I'm not trying to replace him, Sarah," Jackson continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I know what he meant to you, to those kids. His love for you is real and deep, and nothing can ever change that. But I hope, he'd want us all to be happy, however that looks." Sarah opened her eyes to find Jackson watching her with an expression of such vulnerable hope that it took her breath away. Here was a man who had loved her once, who had respected her marriage to his best friend, even when it cost him everything he dreamed of, who had kept a promise to look after her family, not out of obligation, but out of a devotion that had never truly died. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice shaky with the weight of possibility and fear. "But I think I'd like to find out." The smile that spread across Jackson's weathered face was like the sun, breaking through clouds after a long storm. "Slow is good," he agreed, understanding exactly what she meant. "We've got time now, all the time in the world." From across the fairgrounds came a chorus of young voices calling, "Mom! Mr. Stone!" The children were racing toward them, eyes bright with excitement. Lucy's pigtails flying behind her like banners. Michael clutching a blue ribbon from some competition. Jamie proudly displaying a small trophy that caught the late afternoon sunlight dot as they approached. Sarah felt Jackson's handbrush against hers, not taking it. Not yet, but offering comfort and possibility in equal measure. She let her fingers touch his briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the new chapter that was beginning to write itself in their lives. "Come on," she said to them all, her family both old and new. "Let's go home before it gets too late." Together, they walked toward the parking area where Jackson's truck waited, the setting sun painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as tomorrow always did on a working ranch. But for the first time in 3 years, Sarah wasn't facing them alone. The Double S Ranch and her heart had both weathered the storm, emerging stronger for having been broken and carefully mended by patient hands and faithful hearts. Part 6. New foundations. October brought the kind of crisp mornings that made every breath visible and turned the aspen leaves to gold. Coins scattered across the mountainsides. Sarah stood in the kitchen of the main house, watching through the window as Jackson taught the children how to properly stack hay bales in the barn, a skill that required both technique and teamwork. The morning light caught the steam rising from her coffee mug as she observed Jamie and Michael working together to lift a bale, while Lucy appointed herself the official supervisor, pointing out imaginary problems with their technique that made both boys roll their eyes in theatrical exasperation. The scene filled Sarah with a contentment she'd almost forgotten was possible. The partnership between the Double S and Stone Creek was proving even more successful than either she or Jackson had dared to hope. The combined operation allowed them to take advantage of economies of scale that had been impossible when each ranch struggled alone. Their cattle were healthier, thanks to better breeding stock. Their feed costs had dropped significantly through bulk purchasing, and the shared labor meant that essential tasks were completed more efficiently than ever before. More importantly, the children were thriving in ways that went far beyond simple financial security. Jamie had discovered a natural talent for working with horses, spending every free moment in the stable learning from Diego, Jackson's head horseman. Michael had appointed himself the ranch's unofficial engineer, constantly designing improvements to everything from feed systems to fence gates. Even little Lucy had found her place, helping Martha with the chicken coop and proudly collecting eggs each morning, like she was gathering treasure. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah turned to see Jackson standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. After 6 weeks of working together daily, she'd grown accustomed to reading the subtle changes in his expression, and something in his demeanor made her stomach flutter with anticipation. "Coffee's fresh," she offered, stepping aside to let him enter the warm kitchen. "Thanks," he said, accepting the steaming mug she handed him. "Sarah, I wanted to talk to you about something." "About us." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with the weight of possibility and fear. Over the past weeks, their relationship had evolved from wary partnership to something deeper and more complex. There had been stolen moments, hands touching as they worked together, conversations that stretched late into the evening, glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. "I've been thinking," Jackson continued, setting down his coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, "about what Tom said when we made peace. About making sure you and the kids were taken care of. About being the friend you might need someday." Sarah felt her heart begin to pound against her ribs as she watched him struggle with words that seemed too important to get wrong. "The thing is," he said finally, meeting her eyes with the kind of directness that had always been his way, "somewhere along the line, it stopped being just about keeping a promise to Tom. These past weeks, working beside you, watching you with those children, seeing how strong you've become, double quotes, taking a deep breath. I've fallen in love with you all over again. Sarah, not the girl you were 20 years ago, but the woman you are now." The confession hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building between them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But hearing the words spoken aloud made everything real in a way that both thrilled and terrified. "Her, Jackson," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the children's laughter drifting through the window. "I know it's complicated," he said quickly, as if afraid she might stop him before he could say everything that needed saying. "I know you love Tom, and I'm not asking you to forget that or pretend it didn't matter. But I hope, there might be room in your heart for something new. Something different, but just as real." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes as she studied his weathered face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide beneath his usual stoic exterior. This was Jackson Stone stripped of all pretense, offering his heart with the same quiet courage he brought to every challenge in his life. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words emerging from some deep, honest place she'd kept locked away. "Scared of dishonoring Tom's memory, scared of confusing the children, scared of losing what we've built as partners if this doesn't work out." Jackson nodded, understanding flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "I'm scared too. But you know what scares me more? The thought of spending the rest of my life wondering, what if? The thought of letting fear keep us from something that might be wonderful." Before Sarah could respond, the kitchen door burst open and the children tumbled inside, their cheeks flushed from the cold morning air and their eyes bright with excitement. "Mom, guess what?" Lucy announced, bouncing on her toes with barely contained energy. "Mr. Stone says if we finish all our chores early, he'll teach us how to rope cattle from horseback." "Real cattle?" Michael asked, his 8-year-old mind already calculating the logistics of such an adventure. "Well, maybe we'll start with fence posts," Jackson said with a smile that transformed his serious features. "Work our way up to actual cattle once you've mastered the basics." Jamie, ever the practical one, studied Jackson's face with the keen perception of a child who had learned early to read adult emotions. "Are you okay, Mr. Stone? You look kind of funny." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she realized how obvious their emotional conversation must have been to anyone walking into the room. Jackson cleared his throat, shooting her a look that was part apology and part question. "I'm fine, son," he said, ruffling Jamie's sandy hair with affection that had become as natural as breathing. "Just talking to your mom about some grown-up business. Boring stuff," Lucy declared with the dismissive authority of a 7-year-old who had no patience for adult complications. "The most boring," Jackson agreed solemnly, winking at Sarah over the children's heads. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself watching Jackson with new eyes, seeing him not just as her business partner or the children's surrogate father figure, but as a man who had just offered her his heart with a courage that took her breath away. She observed how naturally he moved through their daily routines, how the children gravitated toward him without conscious thought, how he seemed to fit into their lives as if he'd always been there. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, Sarah found Jackson sitting on the porch, staring up at the star-scattered Montana sky that stretched endlessly above them like a promise of infinite possibility. "Beautiful night," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. "The most beautiful," he agreed, though his eyes never left her face. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of cattle settling for the night and the whisper of wind through the newly repaired barn. Finally, Sarah spoke the words that had been building inside her all day. "I think," she said carefully, "that Tom would want us to be happy. All of us." Jackson turned to look at her, hope flickering in his expression like candlelight in a window. "I think," she continued, gathering her courage like a rider gathering reins before a difficult jump, "that maybe it's time to stop being afraid of happiness. Maybe it's time to start believing that some things are meant to be, even when the path to get there isn't what we expected." Jackson reached over and took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of two people who had finally stopped fighting against something that felt as natural as breathing. "So what do we do now?" he asked softly. Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Now we take it one day at a time. We see where this leads us, and we trust that sometimes the best things in life come to us when we're brave enough to let them." Above them, the Montana stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to another chapter beginning in the long story of hearts learning to love again. Part 7. Testing the Waters winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jackson teach the children how to build a proper snowman in the yard, their laughter carrying through the crisp air like bells, ringing in celebration of simple joy. 3 months had passed since that October evening when they'd finally acknowledged the feelings growing between them, and their relationship had evolved with the careful patience of two people who understood that some things were worth doing right. There had been no dramatic declarations or rushed decisions, just a gradual deepening of trust and affection that felt as natural as the changing seasons. The children had adapted to the shift in their family, dynamic with the remarkable resilience that seemed to be their trademark. Lucy had taken to calling Jackson almost Dad when she thought no one was listening, while Michael sought him out for advice on everything from homework to the mysterious workings of the universe. Jamie, always the most cautious of the three, had begun to relax his protective vigilance over their small family, finally trusting that Jackson wasn't going anywhere. "Mom, come help us," Lucy called through the window, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. "Mr. Stone says our snowman needs a woman's touch." Sarah bundled into her coat and boots, stepping out into the winter wonderland that their yard had become. The snow crunched satisfyingly under her feet as she approached the group, where Jackson was helping Michael position stones for their snowman smile. "What exactly does a snowman need a woman's touch for?" she asked with mock indignation. "Hands on her hips style," Jamie declared with the authority of a 10-year-old who had given the matter serious consideration. "Mr. Stone says ladies know about making things look nice. Is that what Mr. Stone says?" Sarah looked pointedly at Jackson, who had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed. "I may have mentioned that you have excellent taste in decoration," he admitted, brushing snow from his gloves, "and that our snowman was looking a bit rustic." Sarah examined their creation critically. The snowman was indeed functional, but lacking in artistic flair. 3 uneven spheres topped with a battered hat and adorned with a crooked carrot nose. "Well," she said finally, "he certainly has character. But perhaps we could refine his appearance just a bit." What followed was an hour of joyful collaboration as they transformed their simple snowman into something that would have made the neighbors stop and stare. Sarah contributed a colorful scarf that had belonged to Tom, and for a moment she felt a pang of guilt at repurposing something so personal. But then she remembered Tom's generous spirit, How he would have loved seeing the children's faces light up with pride at their creation. And the guilt faded into something warmer, a sense that he was still part of their happiness, even if in ways she couldn't fully understand. As the afternoon wore on and the children began to tire from their outdoor adventures, Jackson found himself alone with Sarah for a few precious moments while the kids warmed up inside with hot chocolate. "I've been thinking about Christmas," he said, leaning against the porch railing as snow continued to fall around them in fat, lazy flakes. "What about it?" Sarah asked, though something in his tone made her heart skip a beat. "About where we spend it. Together, I mean." Jackson's words came out in a rush, as if he'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "I know it's presumptuous, and I don't want to push too fast, but the children have been asking if I'll be here for Christmas morning, and I thought ... "Yes," Sarah interrupted, surprising them both with the speed of her response. "Yes? Yes, I'd like you to be here for Christmas morning. I'd like you to be here for a lot of things." Jackson. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The smile that spread across Jackson's face could have melted all the snow in Montana. Without thinking, he reached for her, pulling her into his arms in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. For a moment, they simply held each other. Two people who had found their way back to happiness after years of thinking it might be lost forever. "Are you kissing?" came a small voice from the kitchen window. They sprang apart to find three young faces pressed against the glass, their breath fogging the panes as they stared with unabashed curiosity at the adult's display of affection. "We were hugging," Sarah called back, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something that felt suspiciously like joy. "Looked like kissing to me," Michael declared with the brutal honesty of an 8-year-old. "Would that be okay?" Jackson asked quietly, his question directed as much at the children as at Sarah. If there was some kissing? The three young faces disappeared from the window, and for a moment, Sarah worried they'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But then, the kitchen door burst open and Lucy came racing out, her socks slipping on the snowy porch as she launched herself at Jackson's legs. "Does this mean you're going to marry Mom?" she demanded, looking up at him with eyes that held all the hope and fear of a child who had lost too much already. Jackson knelt down to Lucy's level, his expression serious as he considered her question. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But I can promise you this, whatever happens between your mom and me, I'm not going anywhere. You three are stuck with me whether you like it or not." "We like it," Jamie said firmly, appearing in the doorway with Michael beside him. "We like it a lot." And just like that, the last barriers seemed to fall away. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Jackson gather all three children into a group hug that somehow managed to include her as well. This was what family looked like, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. That evening, as Sarah tucked the children into their beds, she found herself fielding a barrage of questions about the future that she wasn't entirely sure how to answer. "If you marry Mr. Stone, will we still live here?" Michael wanted to know. "Where else would we live?" Sarah replied, smoothing his blankets with hands that trembled slightly. "This is our home. But what if he wants to live at his house?" Jamie pressed, ever the worrier. "Then we'll figure it out together," Sarah said firmly. "That's what families do. They figure things out together." "Will he be our real dad then?" Lucy asked from her bed across the room, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. Sarah's breath caught at the question. "What do you think about that?" "I think," Lucy said slowly, "that we could have two dads. The one in heaven who loved us first, and the one here who loves us now." The simple wisdom of a 7-year-old's perspective brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought, marveling at how children could sometimes see truth more clearly than adults who complicated everything with fear and guilt and overthinking. After the children were finally asleep, Sarah found Jackson waiting for her in the living room. 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table beside the fireplace, where flames danced warmly against the winter cold. "How did that go?" he asked as she settled beside him on the sofa. "Better than I expected," she admitted, curling her feet under her and accepting the warm mug gratefully. "They're remarkably resilient. These kids. They get that from you," Jackson said softly, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "And from Tom," Sarah added, needing to say his name, to acknowledge the foundation he'd laid for all of this happiness. "And from Tom," Jackson agreed without hesitation. "He'd be proud of them." "Proud of you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper around the eaves of the old house. Finally, Jackson spoke the words that had been building between them all day. "I love you, Sarah. I love you and those children more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. And if you'll have me, if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Sarah set down her coffee with hands that shook slightly, then turned to face him fully. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jackson Stone?" "I'm asking if you think you might want to marry me someday," he replied carefully. "When you're ready. When it feels right. When you're sure it's what you want and not just what feels safe or convenient." Sarah studied his weathered face in the firelight, seeing the boy she'd once loved, the man who had respected her marriage even when it cost him everything, the partner who had helped her rebuild not just her ranch but her life. She thought of Tom's words, passed down through Jackson, that maybe things worked out the way they were meant to, even when the path wasn't what anyone expected. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I think I might want to marry you someday, Jackson Stone." The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, full of promise and patience, and the kind of love that had weathered storms and waited for the right season to bloom. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Double S Ranch, blanketing everything in pristine white that spoke of new beginnings and fresh starts. Part 8. New beginning. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers that painted the Montana landscape in shades of purple, yellow, and white, as if the earth itself was celebrating the renewal that seemed to touch everything on the Double S Ranch. Sarah stood in the doorway of the little church where she and Tom had been married 15 years ago, her heart full of emotions too complex to name as she prepared to walk down the aisle toward a different kind of love, one born of friendship, tested by hardship and deepened by time. The ceremony was simple, as she and Jackson had both wanted. Their closest neighbors filled the wooden pews, the same people who had rallied around them during the storm and watched their partnership bloom into something deeper. Mrs. Henderson wept openly from the front row, while old Pete Garrison sat stoically in the back, his weathered hands folded over his best suit. But it was the 3 children sitting in the front pew who made Sarah's heart sing with joy. Jamie looked proud and slightly nervous in his new button-down shirt, his sandy hair combed neatly for once. Michael bounced slightly with barely contained excitement, whispering questions to Martha Wilson about when the ceremony would be over and whether there would really be cake afterward. And Lucy, precious Lucy, wore the blue dress they'd found in town, her hair braided with wildflowers she'd insisted on picking herself that morning. "You ready for this?" her father asked softly, offering his arm as the organist began to play the simple melody they'd chosen. "More ready than I've ever been," Sarah replied, meaning every word dot as she walked down the aisle. Sarah's eyes found Jackson waiting for her at the altar, resplendent in his best suit, with his hair tamed and his storm gray eyes soft with love. Beside him stood Diego, his foreman, serving as best man with the dignity of a man who had watched this love story unfold with patient approval. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of familiar words made new by the circumstances of their speaking. When the minister asked if anyone present could show just 'cause why these two should not be joined in marriage, little Lucy stood up in her pew and declared loudly, "Because they're perfect together," causing a ripple of laughter through the congregation that even the solemn minister couldn't suppress. I think that counts as approval, rather than objection, he said with a smile, waiting for Lucy to sit down before continuing. When it came time for vows, Sarah and Jackson had chosen to speak from their hearts rather than recite traditional words. Jackson went first, his voice steady despite the emotion that flickered across his weathered features. "Sarah," he began, "20 years ago, I thought I knew what love was. I thought it was about possession and passion, and having everything go according to plan. But you've taught me that real love is about partnership and patience, and building something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone." He paused, his eyes finding the children in the front pew. "You've taught me that family isn't just about blood or shared history, but about choosing to love and protect and cherish each other every single day. I promise to be a faithful husband to you and a devoted father to Jamie, Michael, and Lucy for as long as I draw breath." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks as she listened to his words. So different from the vow she'd exchanged with Tom, but no less meaningful for their uniqueness. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was strong despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Jackson," she said, "you came back into my life when I thought I was finished with love, finished with trusting anyone else with my heart or my children's future. You've shown me that the heart has an infinite capacity for love, that honoring the past doesn't mean being afraid of the future." She looked out at the congregation, at the faces of neighbors who had become family, at Martha wiping away tears, and Pete nodding his gruff approval. "You've shown me that community isn't just about geography, but about people who choose to stand by each other through storms and celebrations alike. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face whatever comes with courage and grace, and to love you with the wisdom that comes from having been loved well before." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson's kiss was gentle and sure, full of promise for all the years ahead. The congregation erupted in applause, but Sarah only had eyes for the 3 children racing toward them down the aisle, their faces bright with joy as they launched themselves into the arms of their newly expanded family. The reception was held in the community hall, the same building where town meetings and school plays and countless other gatherings had marked the rhythms of